There is a story buried beneath the floorboards of an old Ohio farmhouse. A story so unbelievable, so intimate, so dangerous, that the people who lived it spent their entire lives pretending it never happened. A lie kept with such devotion, it became the truth. October 1920. A cold wind moved across the fields, bending the dying corn stalks like thin, brittle bones. Inside the farmhouse, a woman named Evelyn Porter stood at the kitchen counter, her hands trembling around the handle of a butcher knife. The blade wasn't for cooking, it was for protection. Because on this night, her husband Walter was returning from the Great War. For 3 years, Evelyn had lived in silence, a silence sweeter than freedom, safer than prayer. Walter had left for the front a cruel man, a drinker, a bully who used his fists to settle ordinary days. When the telegram came announcing his discharge, Evelyn didn't cry. She folded the paper carefully, set it on the table, and sharpened the knife. The clock struck 8. Footsteps approached the door, slow, heavy, uneven, a limp. She held her breath. The doorknob turned. The door opened. But the man who stepped inside wasn't Walter. He wore Walter's uniform. He had Walter's height. His face was shadowed by scars that war had carved into him. But he didn't bark a command. He didn't reach for the whiskey. He didn't even look at her with the sharp, bitter glare she had learned to fear. Instead, he knelt down, slowly, painfully, and extended his hand to the old farm dog that had once cowered from Walter's boots. The dog sniffed him, then astonishingly wagged its tail. Evelyn tightened her grip on the knife, not out of fear, but out of confusion. The man's voice was quiet, apologetic, gentle. He stepped into the kitchen and asked where she kept the kettle, as though he'd never lived here before, as though he had never memorized this house in the cruel way Walter once had. And as Evelyn watched him struggle to light the stove, watched his hands tremble as he searched the wrong drawer for matches, she felt a cold understanding crawl up her spine. This man, this man with her husband's name, was a stranger. But here is where the real danger begins. Because in the days that followed, as the truth unraveled piece by trembling piece, Evelyn discovered something far more terrifying than a returning monster. She discovered the kindest man she had ever known, wearing the face of the one she feared most. And she discovered a secret so heartbreaking, so fatefully twisted, that exposing it would cost her everything: her home, her life, her sanity, maybe even her soul. This is not a story about war. This is not a story about grief. This is the story of a man who stepped into another man's life, and a woman who chose to let him stay. Before we unravel the truth behind the stranger wearing Walter Porter's name, there is something you need to understand. Stories like this do not survive in history books. They live only in whispers, in rumors passed between generations, in letters hidden inside desk drawers and floorboards. This story comes from fragments, court records, diary pages, a deathbed confession, and together they form a single haunting truth. Sometimes the most dangerous lie is the one that protects you. You are about to walk through the 5 clues that revealed the imposter, and the 5 choices that bound Evelyn to him for the rest of her life. You will see how a scarred soldier entered a house expecting only to repay a debt, and instead found a woman whose spirit had been broken long before the war ever began. You will learn why the townspeople whispered that the war had changed Walter, why the sheriff grew suspicious, and why Evelyn herself became the fiercest defender of the lie she once feared. And you will understand how a stranger, someone Evelyn had never met, became the safest place she had ever known. This is not simply a historical mystery. It is an emotional blueprint, a psychological case study of survival, identity, and the impossible choices women have had to make throughout history. By the end of this story, you will know Why the farm could not survive if Walter was declared dead. Why Evelyn could not survive if the real Walter returned. Why the stranger could not leave, even after she uncovered the truth. Why two broken people made a silent pact to bury the past and build a new life. You will hear the moment Evelyn realized the truth, not with fear, but with a strange, forbidden relief. You will hear the impostor's confession, a confession shaped not by deceit, but by a love he never meant to feel. And you will witness the turning point, the moment Evelyn made her most dangerous choice, to protect the lie, to protect the man, to protect herself. Because in this story, the truth isn't the hero. The truth is the threat. This is the roadmap, the moment she realized, the moment he confessed. The moment the sheriff came to the door, the moment they had to decide whose name would survive and whose would be buried forever. By the time you reach the end, you will understand why the headstone in the cold Ohio cemetery reads the name of a man who did not earn it, and how the man who did earn it never wanted his own. This is the story of a secret partnership, a chosen truth, a dangerous alliance between a grieving woman and the stranger who loved her long before he ever stepped into her home. Now we step into the shadows of that farmhouse, into the silence between two people bound by a lie large enough to build a life on. This is where the real story begins. The first days after Walter's return were a kind of quiet Evelyn had never experienced. Not peaceful. Peace was too fragile a word. It was more like standing in the center of a storm that hadn't decided whether to destroy you or spare you. The man in her kitchen moved with a care Walter never had. He spoke softly, waited for her to finish speaking before he answered, and apologized whenever he brushed past her in the hallway, as though his very presence required permission. None of it made sense. The real Walter had been predictable in the worst ways. He wanted dinner ready by 5. He slammed doors when irritated. He drank himself into a fury and blamed the world for every ache his own temper caused. But this man, this scarred, gentle man, woke before dawn to help with the milking. He repaired the fence on the north field without being asked. He knelt down to untangle the dog's collar from the porch railing, whispering an apology to the old animal as though he understood exactly how much fear had been once beaten into it. Evelyn watched all of this with a suspicion that never fully left her lungs. One afternoon, she found a small tear in the sleeve of his uniform jacket and offered to mend it. When she reached into the pocket, her fingers brushed against something stiff and worn. A photograph. She pulled it out. It wasn't her. The woman in the picture was younger, smiling, standing beside a man whose face wasn't Walter's. The stranger saw her holding the photograph and froze completely, like a man preparing to be shot. He didn't grab it. He didn't explain. He only lowered his head. The photograph trembled in Evelyn's hand. That night, the first piece of the puzzle fell into place. But the second piece, far more damning, came 2 evenings later. Rain battered the house, drumming against the roof with a relentless rhythm. The stranger couldn't sleep. Evelyn heard him pacing softly down the hallway, and then heard something else. Music. Faint. Hesitant. A melody played on the old upright piano Walter had always hated. She crept down the stairs, her hands sliding along the railing. The parlor was dark except for the glow of a single lamp, and there he sat, his scarred fingers gliding over the keys as though guided by memory deeper than language itself. The sound was fragile, aching, beautiful. It stopped suddenly when he saw her. His hands snapped back as if the piano were aflame. And in that moment, the truth struck her with the force of thunder. Walter could not play. The man on that bench was not her husband. Her breath caught, not from fear, but from something far more treacherous. Relief. A relief so sharp it almost felt like guilt. The next morning she tested him. Subtle things. She salted the eggs too much. Walter liked them that way. The stranger barely touched them. She asked him to fetch the ledger where they tracked farm expenses. Walter had always kept it on the second shelf of the pantry. The stranger checked the wrong shelf. Twice. Then finally she asked the question she had never dared ask Walter. "Do you love this farm?" The stranger paused long enough to show his answer wasn't rehearsed. He said he didn't know. He was still learning it. But he loved the feeling of mending something broken. He loved the mornings when the light hit the fields like gold. And he loved the peace here. Walter had never spoken that word. Peace. That night, Evelyn lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of his breathing from the other side of the room. The realization was no longer a whisper. It was a truth standing at the foot of her bed. The man sleeping in her house was not Walter Porter. The next morning she confronted him, not with anger, not with the knife she had once prepared for her husband's return, but with a quiet, trembling courage she didn't know she possessed. She asked who he really was. The stranger didn't deny it. His face collapsed into something raw and devastated. His hands shook, and he said the name that would forever change the course of her life. He said, "My name is Samuel." He looked smaller as he said it, not weaker, just stripped bare, as if removing Walter's name had removed the armor that held him together. He told her he had been Walter's trenchmate in France. He told her Walter had spoken of her constantly, though not with tenderness, with guilt, with shame, with the fear that he would never come home and she would never know a moment of peace. Then came the firestorm. He told her Walter had died, not heroically, not instantly, but slowly, painfully, with a final request that Samuel had no right to accept. Walter's last words were not about patriotism or legacy. They were instructions. Instructions to save the farm. Instructions to keep Evelyn safe from the debts Walter had left behind. Instructions to take his identity because the government would pay a living soldier, but not a dead one. Evelyn listened in silence, and then Samuel confessed the part that broke him. He had not expected to care for her. He had not expected to stay longer than necessary. He had not expected her. But the moment he stepped inside the house, he saw a woman who had been hurt more deeply by life than war had ever hurt him. And somewhere between the mended fences and the shared meals and the piano melodies carried on sleepless nights, he fell in love with her. It was a confession Evelyn did not know how to answer, because instead of terror, instead of fury, instead of betrayal, she felt something else blooming inside her, a calm she had not known in years, a quiet that felt like safety, a future she had never dared imagine. But love built on a lie cannot survive on its own. And outside that house, danger was already circling, because the townspeople were whispering, and Walter's uncle, the sheriff, had begun asking questions. The storm was coming, and Evelyn would have to choose whether to expose the truth or protect the man who had stepped into her life like a second chance she never asked for. The house felt different after that night by the fire. Not safer, not more dangerous. Just suspended. Like every wall had leaned in to listen. Over the next few days, Evelyn found herself noticing things about the man living in Walter's place, things she had been too afraid or too numb to see before. He spoke softly. He moved like someone who had learned to survive by not drawing attention to himself. He carried guilt the way other men carried a pocket watch. Always there, always heavy. But the strangest thing was this. He didn't look at her the way Walter used to. Walter had looked at her like a possession, an obligation, a burden he never asked for. This man looked at her as if he was constantly asking permission simply to exist. One morning, Evelyn found him repairing the garden gate. Walter had repeatedly promised to fix it and never did. It wasn't because he forgot. It was because it wasn't important to him. But the man rebuilding it now paused when he noticed her watching. His eyes softened. Not flirtatious, not bold, almost apologetic. He asked if she slept well. She lied and said yes. He smiled in a way that said he didn't believe her, but wouldn't push. Evelyn realized something quietly devastating. She was unlearning fear, just a little, just enough to feel the strangeness of peace. But peace brings clarity, and clarity brings questions. That afternoon, while sweeping the porch, she found something lodged between the floorboards. A small metal box, dented and muddy, as though it had traveled through hell and decided to stop only when it reached her. Inside was a folded letter, water-stained and nearly unreadable, but a few lines remained clear. If she asks, tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I tried. Tell her she deserved better than me. It wasn't his handwriting, it wasn't Walter's, but the signature was a name she had seen once before, on the photograph she had found in his coat. Samuel, the man in her house, the man who wasn't Walter, the man who carried guilt like a second skin. She wasn't imagining it anymore. The puzzle pieces weren't scattered. They were forming a painful, inevitable truth. When he returned from town later that day, she stood on the porch clutching the box, her hands trembling. Not with fear this time, but with needing answers. He froze when he saw what she held. His shoulders lowered, as though he had been waiting for this moment. He walked toward her slowly, each step taken like someone approaching a grave. Evelyn whispered that she needed to know his real name. He didn't flinch. He didn't deny. He only nodded. And in that nod, she felt the world tilt. He told her the truth she had unknowingly braced for, that the war had taken many men and buried even more secrets. He told her that some promises are made with dying breaths, binding tighter than vows, tighter than blood. He told her husband hadn't returned from the trenches, not alive, not as himself, not at all. Evelyn felt something inside her crumble. Not grief, she had grieved her husband in countless ways long before he ever stepped foot on a battlefield. It was the collapse of certainty. The realization that she had been living inside a story built on survival, not truth. And yet, even as her world shifted, even as every answer brought 10 more questions, she noticed something impossible. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Not of him. Not of the truth. And that was more terrifying than anything else. Because trust, once broken, doesn't return easily. But trust that grows in the presence of a lie, that is something far more dangerous, something far more intimate, something far more real. He invited her inside before saying another word, not to hide the conversation from the world. There was no one around for miles. But because some truths are too heavy to be spoken in the open air, inside he stood by the kitchen table, the place where Walter had once slammed fists, broken plates, and bruised her spirit in ways no one ever saw. Now another man stood there, quiet, steady, trembling. He said his name was Samuel, just Samuel, a farm boy turned soldier, a man who didn't ask for heroics but found himself surrounded by death anyway. He said her husband was the kind of man who survived every battle except the one inside himself. Walter had carried his cruelty into the trenches. Men feared him, hated him. But Samuel had been assigned to him. He didn't choose it. He was ordered to watch Walter's back. Samuel's voice cracked when he said the war changed nothing about Walter except the direction of his violence. One night during a bombardment, Walter had shoved Samuel into a crater as debris rained down. He yelled that if anyone deserved to die, it wasn't him, not Walter, but fate took no orders. A shell struck the ground beside them. When the dust settled, Walter was barely alive, bleeding, broken, drowning in his own fear. Samuel crouched beside him, closing a wound that couldn't be closed. Walter knew it. Samuel knew it. The dying man rasped out a bitter truth. If the army reported him dead, the bank would seize the farm. He'd left Evelyn with debts she didn't know existed, debts he'd hidden, debts he'd created, debts that would swallow her whole. He told Samuel that the uniform didn't matter, the scars didn't matter. Men came back unrecognizable every day. He ordered Samuel, with the last cruel, desperate breath he ever took, to take his identity, to go home in his place, to keep the farm from being taken. And then he died. Samuel said he sat there for a long time, cradling the body of a man he despised, wondering why someone so heartless would choose to save his wife in the only way he knew how. Maybe guilt, maybe duty, maybe fear, maybe, deep down, Walter had known she deserved better. Samuel told her he didn't come to steal a life. He came to fulfill a promise, to keep her land, her animals, her safety, to leave once the debts were settled. He wasn't supposed to touch anything that belonged to her. Not her space, not her trust, certainly not her heart. And then his voice broke. He admitted he'd failed, because somewhere between patching the roof, burying the old whiskey bottles, repairing the garden gate, and learning how to speak softly for the first time in his life, he had fallen in love with her. Not the way he planned, not the way he wanted, not even the way he believed he deserved. He fell in love with the way she still cared for the things Walter neglected, the way she apologized when she didn't need to, the way she flinched at kindness as though it were a trick, the way she carried loneliness like a stitched wound she refused to reopen. He said he loved her because she survived, because she endured, because she didn't know her own strength. Evelyn felt the room tilt, the stove, the table, the windows, all of it blurred like a watercolor in the rain. She told him she didn't know whether to scream or sob. She didn't know if she was grieving Walter, grieving her past, or grieving the small, fragile hope she'd begun to feel with the man now standing across from her. Samuel said she didn't know him forgiveness, or affection, or trust. He only wanted her to know the truth so she could choose her future freely, with him, without him, or without anyone at all. He said he would leave that night if she asked. She only needed to point to the door. For a long, breathless moment, Evelyn didn't speak, not because she had nothing to say, but because her heart was saying too much all at once. She wasn't sure she believed in destiny, or fate, or second chances, but she believed in what she saw. A man who had taken another man's place and somehow become everything the original should have been. A man who carried guilt not like a chain, but like a compass, guiding every step. A man who would leave if she whispered the word. The truth didn't make things easier. It made them harder, heavier, more real. But for the first time in years, Evelyn realized something powerful. She finally had a choice, a real one. Not a choice between survival and suffering, but between past and future, between fear and possibility, between a life she had endured and a life she might actually want. And that was the most terrifying revelation of all. Evelyn stood in the silence left hanging between them. The truth, now spoken aloud, felt like a storm that had finally broken open. Not gentle, not destructive, but cleansing in a way she wasn't prepared for. She didn't tell Samuel to stay. She didn't tell him to leave. She simply asked for time. Time to breathe without fear. Time to understand her own heart. Time to decide whether the future waiting for her was a future she could step into without trembling. He nodded once, a soldier's nod, full of restraint and heartbreak and respect, and told her he would sleep in the barn until she decided, not as punishment, not as distance, but because he wanted her to feel truly free for the first time in her life. And when he walked out the door gently, quietly, without the slam she had braced for her entire marriage, Evelyn felt her lungs expand in a way they never had before. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was possibility. And that alone felt like sunlight after years of winter. The farm was still fragile. Her heart was still fragile. But the future no longer felt like a shadow hovering over her bed. It felt like a door, one she could choose to open or close on her own terms. And that moment where a woman finds her own power again, that is why stories like this one exist. Because history is full of secrets, full of hidden love, full of lies that became salvation and truths that came too late, and people who discovered their strength only when everything around them fell apart. This is the heart of vintage love tales. Stories of women who survived, stories of men who changed, stories of second chances wrapped in mystery, betrayal, and unexpected tenderness. If you want more historical romance stories with twists, secrets, and heart-shaking emotion, stories that make you feel something, you're in the right place. This channel is where forgotten love stories come alive, where danger and desire dance together, where every episode carries you into a world of longing, tension, heartbreak, and hope. And if this story stirred you, if you felt Evelyn's fear, her confusion, her awakening, then make sure you subscribe right now. Because I release new historical romance audio stories every week, each one filled with suspense, passion, and a twist you won't see coming. Click subscribe, click the notification bell, step into the past with me, because the best love stories are the ones history tried to hide. The years would tell the rest of the story, not loudly, not with fireworks or scandal, but with the quiet, steady rhythm of two people learning how to live without fear. Evelyn did choose Samuel, not on that first night, not even that first week, but slowly, carefully, in the soft hours before dawn, in the gentle kindness he offered without demand, in the safety she realized she no longer had to bargain for. She chose him the way healing happens, one breath at a time. And in choosing him, she chose herself. By the time she was an old woman, her hair silver, her hands lined with the years she earned, the story of the imposter had faded from rumor into silence. To the town, he was simply Henry Porter, a man softened by war, a man devoted to his wife, a man who built a life out of soil and sweat and second chances. But the truth didn't vanish. It lived quietly between two people who had nothing left to fear from it. When Evelyn died, she died in the bed she had once been afraid to sleep in, the same bed that had once held a monster, and later held the only man who ever truly loved her. Samuel, Walter's chosen name, held her hand until her final breath. He didn't cry as the doctor closed her eyes. He only whispered one sentence, a promise he kept for a lifetime. You were always worth saving. At the cemetery, the headstone still reads, Henry Porter, beloved husband. The world never knew the difference, but Evelyn did, Samuel did, and maybe that's the point, because the right love story doesn't always come wrapped in the right name. Sometimes it arrives disguised as a stranger, a man with another man's coat, another man's scars, another man's history. Yet somehow, impossibly, he becomes the one person who finally gives you a future. So remember this, the truth that ties the whole story together. Sometimes the greatest love of your life is the one you never expected, and the one the world was never meant to know.